If you are someone who loves roller coasters as much as I do, and you talk about it to anyone who will listen as much as I do, you have likely encountered several people who think you are insane. Whether it's your aunt at the barbecue asking how you're spending your summer, or a coworker chatting about what you did over the weekend, if you tell enough people you go to amusement parks, you will encounter somebody who says, "What? Amusement parks? Those places are dangerous." And you have to calmly explain without insulting their intelligence or critical thinking skills that, actually, statistically, they're not. The go-to line for enthusiasts is, "You are, according to all safety data, in more danger in your car on the way to the park than you are on any of the rides." There are a couple of high-profile accidents, but if anything that proves it, because they wouldn't be high-profile if they weren't so rare. Planes hardly ever crash, so every time one does, it makes the news. But car crashes don't get the same airtime because they happen every day. It's not new. But the truth is a little more nuanced. Amusement parks are generally very safe, but water parks slightly less so. Not enough that it should keep you from visiting, but enough that you had better obey all the lifeguards' instructions. And traveling fairs and carnivals? You'll probably still be fine, it's mostly flat rides at those places. But when a ride accident pops up on the news, more often than not, it's one of these traveling shindigs where somebody wasn't given enough time to properly assemble and check the machinery. But we enthusiasts proudly proclaim that rides are made to scare you as much as possible while keeping you perfectly safe. These things are designed by experts and inspected and tested every day before anyone is allowed on them. Millions of people ride every summer without incident. And besides, accidents are bad for business. No one would go if they thought they would get hurt. But if you've spent much time around people who know too much about amusement park history, like I do, you already know about one park which flew in the face of every piece of conventional wisdom I've laid out so far. A tragical place elevated to urban legend by those who survived the 80s. The only vacation destination to really make you earn the "I survived" t-shirt. A place so improbably dangerous it could only exist in New Jersey. Because everything's legal in New Jersey. In 1965, three families got together and founded Great Gorge Resort in unincorporated Vernon Township, New Jersey. It was a successful ski resort and turned out several Olympic medalists in downhill skiing, snowboarding, and ski jumping. There were reportedly plans to build a full Olympic skiing and snowboarding training facility that never materialized. But it was naturally an incredibly seasonal business. The owners were constantly looking for ways to bring in money during the off-season, opening attractions like a zoo, grass skiing demonstrations, and using something called snow mats to allow guests to go down the trails and the jump without snow. But none of it was enough. In 1968, another ski resort had opened just to the north called Vernon Valley. They were apparently more successful because when Great Gorge was foreclosed on in 1971 after several seasons of light snow, Vernon Valley bought them to create one massive ski slope complex. In 1974, the whole resort complex was bought by Great American Recreation, which heavily invested in snowmaking equipment to avoid the fate of Great Gorge. They also continued to invest in ways to attract guests in the off-season, in ways no one could have predicted. In 1976, they opened an alpine slide. It was a common move for ski resorts in the 70s. People would pay to take a little car down a concrete track and get a few thrills and views along the way. Several mountain resorts still have some form of this attraction today. Eugene Mulvihill, the head of Great American Recreation, took a very hands-on approach to making Vernon Valley a year-round destination. After a few more attraction openings, including some summer sports facilities and several more water slides, Vernon Valley Summer Park was given its own name, Action Park, where you're the center of the action. The guiding philosophy of Action Park was that guests don't want to be in a safely controlled environment. It was much more fun to hold your fate in your own hands. So they opened an alpine slide, but it let you control your own speed. And it didn't really work well. You could either speed down basically brakeless or inch down at kiddie ride speed. And people who wanted to play Mad Max were not kind to the people who wanted to avoid skinning their legs and arms by getting ejected onto a concrete tube. It was reportedly common for speed racers to just pick up their carts, get out of the ride, and go around the cause of the holdup. They opened a raft racer called the Surf Hill, but the dividers were too low, so people could cross over and crash into each other. And the 7th track had an extra hill employees had stuffed rafts under to launch riders sky high that was nicknamed the Backbreaker. They had a whitewater raft ride called the Colorado River Ride, but it was wilder than was safe and included a tunnel section where many riders brained themselves on the roof. They had a bumper boats ride, but the boats were a little small, so taller riders would have to stick their legs out, putting them in danger of getting their feet smashed in a collision. Also, they leaked gas on their riders sometimes. They had a kayak pond, but there were underground fans, so you'd have to battle waves. They had a speedboat zone, but its pond was full of snakes. They had 2 different types of go-karts, but employees found out that if you stuck a tennis ball in the speed governor, you could get them to go 50 miles an hour, and after close, they drove them on the highway, which for some reason ran through the park. They had a skate park, but only for one summer because the concrete was rough and the edges were sharp. They had diving cliffs, but the part of the pool where the divers landed wasn't marked off, so swimmers didn't know to stay out of the way and got landed on. All of this sounds like incompetent ride design. And it is. But there were several contributing factors, many operational. You don't get people being pressured by the aggressive driver behind them to go warp speed down the alpine slide if the operator spaces people out properly. The park staff was mostly local teenagers tasked with keeping people safe in unreasonably dangerous situations. It's one thing to hire a 16-year-old lifeguard, but at Action Park, the managers were 16 too. And the clientele was, shall we say, less manageable than average? When you advertise yourself as a place where people can do whatever they want, you're going to attract people who want to do stuff they wouldn't get away with anywhere else. They also marketed to Spanish-speaking populations without bothering to hire Spanish-speaking lifeguards, so add that to the liability list. The park also sold alcohol for some reason and became known in the local teenage population as a place that did not card. This sort of attitude led to even normal situations becoming hold-my-beer occasions. One of the most famous and most photographed attractions is the Tarzan Swing. If you've been to an old enough water park, you've probably been on a zipline before, and you probably discovered that the human body weighs more than you expect, and also your hands are still wet, so odds are your very first time down a zipline, you fell off immediately. And of course, the Tarzan swing was over a spring-fed pond, and was therefore so cold, some guests went into shock when they hit the water and had to be pulled out by lifeguards. And of course, the only exit from the pond was way at the far end, so novice jumpers had to swim the whole way, holding up the line and causing public humiliation. Because the line for the Tarzan swing snaked around the edge of the pond, and was right at rope level. So every jumper had an audience. This turned a rope swing into performance art. People would give the line the middle finger, men would pull down their trunks, women would pull up their tops, because who was going to stop them? I've talked a lot about the failings of the staff and the guests, but make no mistake, the dead speedboat pondfish stinks from the head. Eugene Mulvihill loved Action Park and turned it into the family business. It was his guiding philosophy that guests should be in control of their own experience, whatever the consequences. He designed a lot of the rides himself in the days when there was little government regulation. And if the boss doesn't take steps to keep guests safe, why should you? We have first aid for 'em, don't we? Guests who needed antiseptic spray were told to step inside a circle on the floor of the first aid shack, and if they stayed inside the circle, they won a prize. Then, a staff member would soak them with a foul-smelling orange spray that hurt every open place which needed antiseptic. The 2 or 3 times that a guest actually managed to stay inside the circle despite the pain, they had to think up a prize to give them fast. The number of people hurt was of great concern to the city of Vernon, mainly because their hospital would receive 5 to 10 Action Park victims a day. So they reached an agreement. Action Park would buy the city of Vernon more ambulances to make up for the inflated demand. Those who visited the park were only half ignorant of the danger. It became a rite of passage for area school kids, the stuff playground legends were made of.
You'd see like a kid in the summer covered in friction burns, and you'd just be like, oh, how was Action Park?
Locals referred to it as Traction Park, Accident Park, or Class Action Park, but Mulvihill ensured that the park was protected from any legal recourse. Locals had a fun name for the tidal wave pool, too. It was known as the Grave Pool, because 3 people died. The wave patterns were apparently rougher and cycled longer than other wave pools, and the population Action Park drew from would have been used to wave hopping in the Atlantic Ocean, which is saltwater. Freshwater pools don't provide the same buoyancy, and people who overestimated their swimming ability and the depth of the sloped pool would cling desperately to the rungs of the escape ladders every wave cycle. New lifeguards were stationed at the deep end of the grave pool for their first posting, because veterans knew they would end up having to pull out 3 to 5 people during their first half-hour rotation. They used the most dangerous attraction at the park for rookie hazing. A 15-year-old boy from Brooklyn named George Lopez drowned in the grave pool on July 24, 1982. As did Donald DePass, a 20-year-old man from Brooklyn, on August 27, 1984, and Gregory Grandchamps, an 18-year-old from Queens, on July 19, 1987. And that's only half. The first death at Action Park occurred on July 8, 1980, when 19-year-old George Larson was launched from his cart on the Alpine slide and hit his head on a rock, putting him in a coma until he died in the hospital on July 16th. Gene Mulvihill told authorities that Georgie was an employee, because if an employee dies, you don't have to report it to the state. But in reality, Larson had worked as an operator on the ski lift that took people up the mountain one winter. He was strictly a guest at the time of his death and had never worked at Action Park. On July 7, 1982, 27-year-old Jeffrey Nathan fell out of his kayak and, while trying to get back into his boat, made contact with a grate that had been electrified by a live wire from one of the underwater fans. 2 more members of his family were electrocuted too, but they lived. The 27-year-old went into cardiac arrest and was pronounced dead at a Warwick, New York hospital. The park argued that he couldn't have been electrocuted because there were no burns on his body, to which I say, why? To what end? How did he die that would make you look better? Anyway, the coroner pointed out that victims of water electrocutions typically do not have skin burns, because they're wet. The park also disputed the claim that a 7 or 8 inch section of wire was exposed and live underwater, saying it was only a nick. The extent of the maintenance failure remains unconfirmed. There was also a death on the Tarzan swing in 1984, when a guest suffered a heart attack upon entering the pool. We don't even know the date this occurred or the cause of the heart attack. People speculate that the freezing cold spring water triggered it, but there's no record. We don't even know his age or his name. Records of these deaths are hard to come by. Jean Mulvihill even allegedly cut the official death toll in half at the time by listing the grave pool not as an attraction, but as a swimming pool. Attractions had low regulatory standards in the 80s, but pools were only required to be maintained and have trained lifeguards on duty. So the official attraction body count was only 3, which Jean of course argued wasn't that bad given the number of guests they saw every year, apparently even the year 1982, when they had 2 deaths a week apart. And that doesn't even account for the injuries, which there are an even worse record of. The reported injury toll for 1986, according to the New Jersey Herald, was over 110, including 45 head injuries and 10 fractures. The Alpine slide alone accounted for 26 head injuries and 14 fractures between 1984 and 86. So maybe those speed demons could calm down with the peer pressuring children. And these numbers are only the injuries that got officially reported. So-called serious injuries were required to be reported to the state, but the rest were not. So it's safe to assume the real numbers were much higher given the walk it off and rub some dirt in it attitude of the time. Staff and guests both had a vested interest in suffering in silence. Pride. I don't mean to sound at all judgmental here. I knocked a toenail off my left foot on some stairs at Blizzard Beach once and tried not to let on because I was already halfway up the stairs, so I was riding Summit Plummet, bleeding or no bleeding. The difference here is that I hid my toe, assuming Disney employees wouldn't let an injured guest go down their biggest slide. The Action Park staff seems actively apathetic and the management negligent at best. And I haven't even told you about the slide so dangerous Action Park wouldn't let people ride it. On the way up the ski lift to Upper Action Park, if you looked down to throw things at people riding the Alpine slide, you would also see this. What, in the name of George Washington Gale Ferris Jr., was this? The answer is a cautionary tale about tunnel vision. This is the Cannonball Loop, a ride utterly determined to become the world's first looping water slide. It's hard to separate litigation from legend here since so much myth has grown up around this slide. People had a lot of time to think on the way up that ski lift. But what is clear is that Eugene Mulvihill was dead set on claiming his spot in history. But here is where we remember why the amusement park ride design industry does not have a hobbyist contingent. Because, look at this. It doesn't look like something that was built to be ridden. It looks like one of those obviously photoshopped roller coaster clickbait thumbnails. It looks like a 10-year-old won the lottery and decided to play real-life roller coaster tycoon. It looks like a prop in a Russian bootleg of that Off the Rails Final Destination scene. If Timmy Turner didn't have fairy godparents, just access to Home Depot's entire stock of black trash cans, this would be the result. This man designed his groundbreaking first looping water slide with a circular loop. If you've seen a roller coaster, you may have noticed the loops are not circles. They're teardrop shapes. That's because a body moving with velocity in a circular motion will experience centrifugal force. If that body is a person, it will say, ow. It is an unpleasant sensation having your forward velocity suddenly converted into vertical G's. So after the first few looping rides in history, people figured out you could fix that by squeezing the circle. If it's teardrop shaped, you're basically gradually directing the body's momentum up and then guiding its fall back down. If it's circular, you're whipping it like a shot put. And that's not necessarily bad. Centrifugal force was the entire basis of a formerly popular flat ride model. But if you turned that ride fully vertical, you would have to be absolutely sure you were working with enough force that nobody detaches at the peak of the arc. And you can do that, but you can't unstick them all at the bottom of the loop. There's just no way to make sure everyone will make it around and no one slams into the underside of the curve. Now, did Gene Mulvihill pay employees $100 to risk their necks going down it as test dummies? Did people come out inexplicably facing the wrong direction? Did test dummies come out the other side without their heads? Probably. Survivors have said as much. In any other situation, you'd write this off as a big fish story about how life was rougher when I was a kid and the snow was over my head when I walked 10 miles to school uphill both ways. But if it's Action Park, you say, yeah, sounds about right. That's the level of liability we're operating on here. That's not to say the idea of a looping water slide is inherently insane. I have actually personally ridden one in Wisconsin. And people tend to get hung up on the trapdoor at the bottom of the loop to evac people who don't get up enough speed to make it around, but Scorpion's Tail had one at the top for the exact same purpose. I never saw it used because the people who made this slide knew how to calculate potential energy, but it was there. The thing I get hung up on, which has been reported by former employees, was how the first test riders lost some teeth when they hit the loop, and then subsequent test riders would come out with unexplained lacerations. And when they went in to see if something was up with the padding they used to cover the places people routinely slammed into, the padding had teeth stuck in it. These people were getting bit by the wrong end of somebody else's disembodied teeth. Name another place where that would happen and they would keep testing. And boy, did they keep testing. Gene Mulvihill kept testing and testing the slide as if enough trial runs would make it work somehow. It's impossible to calculate how much time and money was poured into this slide alone, but it was a lot. And the more you hear about the ceaseless development of the Cannonball Loop, the more you start to feel like some who have researched it before. Like the entire park became supporting infrastructure to fund the quest for the world's first looping water slide. For years, it was thought that the slide never even opened to guests, only employees who were desperate enough to take the $100, and Gene's son Andy Mulvihill, who suited up in his hockey gear to protect himself during the ride. But documentarian Seth Porges did uncover footage of it operating apparently for about a month before the New Jersey Carnival Amusement Ride Safety Board shut it down. So I guess Gene finally found the line. The question that people who find out about this place after the fact always end up asking is, why did anyone go back? Everyone knew someone who got badly scraped up there at least. 2 people died in the summers of 82 and 84, so who was buying a ticket in 85? And listen, I'm not going to pretend like I don't understand the initial appeal. In 4th grade, we spent a whole recess building a sledding hill off the snow mounds the plow built at the edge of the school parking lot. It went straight down into a little snow pit carved unintentionally by previous riders. We called it the Butt Buster. And sure enough, no matter how thick your snow pants were, it was a couple minutes before you could comfortably sit in a sled again. But you see, that meant that most of us only rode it once. At least until tomorrow's recess, when our memory of how bad it hurt faded enough that our need to not look chicken won out. But it was only open a couple of days before the teachers decided someone could get actually hurt, and they shut it down. Where were Action Park's grown-ups? Sure, in 2nd grade, Amanda broke her arm falling off the balance beam, so we all began the next recess by trying to fall off the balance beam and break our arms, because none of us had done that before. But that was 2nd grade. We were 7. We didn't know what breaking an arm felt like. In middle school, I landed a sled jump wrong and got the wind knocked out of me hard, and thought twice every time I caught air on my sled for the rest of the week. You're supposed to develop a self-preservation instinct at some age. And the adults around us who understood the danger we were playing with kept us from breaking our arms on the balance beam. But parents just kept bringing their kids to this park. And kids would go back to school and show off their scars. A big part of it is that Action Park was way more to its community than a morgue. It held concerts, events, heritage festivals. An episode of MTV's Headbangers Ball was filmed there.
It's just like coming to Broadway.
And that's not even to mention the hundreds of jobs and the tourism dollars from people visiting. There were a lot of reasons to visit besides the slides. And people weren't even concerned about the poor construction of those slides. Action Park reportedly had the same air about it as other parks I've been to, where people deep down don't believe they'll get hurt at a place designed for fun. But other people who visited said the knowledge that you really could get hurt was half the fun. Maybe it was a mix of both that made people so comfortable taking all the risks they were allowed to. Action Park told you that you controlled the action, but in reality, it was completely out of control. Maybe you theoretically could keep your tube sailing safely down the Colorado River rapids, but not if there are 5 tubes on your tail. You can't tell people it's their own fault if they're hurt on the Alpine slide and then put them in a cart with a broken brake lever. But they were able to convince people that anything that went wrong was their own fault. So everyone who got seriously hurt had only themselves to blame. They were stupid. Not like you. It won't happen to you. But if the human will to live wasn't enough to take down Action Park, what was? Insurance fraud. Eventually, the company which provided Accident Park with the necessary liability insurance dropped them as a client. So Gene Mulvihill set up his own shell insurance company in the Cayman Islands that did nothing but defend the park against lawsuits to make sure Gene didn't have to pay anybody's hospital bills. And money laundering. Also money laundering. And he would never pay out settlements. Every injury case that was filed was either dropped or taken to court. And once that was common knowledge, it scared off people from filing at all. Legal bills on top of medical bills is no joke. And even if Gene was ordered to pay by the courts, he just wouldn't. Until you sent the marshals after him, they became a common sight at the park. He avoided a lot of payments because people didn't take it that far. But it only worked for so long. The double deaths of 1984 tied the park up in court for years, and it was financially unstable by the 90s. In 1994, Mulvihill's own shell company could no longer insure the park. So they operated without insurance for 2 years, which is illegal, not that Gene cared at this point. But once one of his main investors and best friend from back when he was a disgraced Wall Street fraudster finally got by the FEC for financial crimes, it was over. Great American Recreation was bankrupt, and Action Park closed in 1996. It only stayed closed for 2 years before it was purchased by a large resort chain and renamed to Mountain Creek to get away from Action Park's reputation. Attendance had been decreasing in recent years due to increased media coverage of the park's dangers. So they took out the more dangerous attractions and added in safe, standard slides. It operated as an average regional water park until 2010, when it was repurchased by Gene Mulvihill. He died 2 years later, and the park is now run by his son and former hockey pad crash dummy, Andrew. He believes strongly in his father's vision and maintains that he is continuing his legacy. But most of his legacy is illegal now, so debatable. It was briefly renamed to Action Park in 2014 to capitalize on nostalgia, but today Mountain Creek operates as an unremarkable regional water park. You would never know what it used to be unless you wander across the street and notice the newly built subdivision has a pond that looks a little too much like a boating circuit. The entire culture of the amusement industry changed in the 80s and 90s, and more regulations were put in place, in no small part thanks to incidents like those common at Action Park. It's those regulations that give us the confidence to enjoy rides and slides freely today, without the fun atmosphere being marred by seeing your friend carted off in an ambulance. We can have the fun we have today and the amusement park fan culture we have because of regulations written in blood. Action Park has nevertheless left its mark on New Jersey and the surrounding tri-state area. It lives in the memories of those who survived it and is often thrown around as a "you know you're from Jersey when" childhood memory. People remember it for its thrills, for its spills, or for the alcohol and concussion-induced gap in their memory.
Every member of my family was injured in that park at some time or another. They called it Traction Park. That
Class
was
Action Park?
Class Action Park, the lawyers called it. People would drown in the wave pool. There was an alpine slide that you could just go flying off of, and there was no rail at all.
It was a plastic thing you sat on, and it had a control stick that would like have brake or fast, and it was always broken. So it doesn't matter, you just zoom by, and if you try to stop, you'd scrape up your elbows, and you jump off like an 18-foot cliff into a pool, swimming pool, and then people would just jump on you because there's no rules.
That's crazy.
No, it's really crazy. So it was called Action Park. I loved it. I think I did. I don't even remember. It's probably terrible.
Former guests talk about it like they survived a war together and are bonded by unique trauma. They simultaneously lament that everything is so safe now and their kids never have that same chance to test their mettle by playing chicken with a concrete tube, and admit that they would never let their kids go somewhere like that. This is the same age group of people who complain that kids never go outside anymore and also won't let their teens bike across town unsupervised. Grown-ups are weird, and stuff like this is the reason why. I think Chris Gethard puts it best at the end of the HBO documentary on the subject. We are extremely happy that we were able to grow up the way we did, and simultaneously so furious that we had to grow up that way.
There's nothing in the world like Action Park.
And thank goodness for that.